This video is sponsored by Sunflex UK. Dealing with disappointment is a fact of life. Things don't work out as planned, and the best we can do is learn from the experience and move on. I've been in business as an architect for 14 years, and this is the first video in a series about my disappointments. Any architect who has been around for a while will tell you about their unbuilt projects, missed opportunities, unrealized designs, lots of work and nothing to show for it. I've had several jobs over the years that could have been brilliant if only they'd been built. So why didn't these projects go from the drawing board to the building site? And what can be learned from it? If you are thinking of altering or extending your home or even building a new house, there are some valuable lessons to draw from these projects. I don't think people want to listen to an architect whining about jobs that never got built, so I'm going to use these projects to give you an insight into how the design and construction process actually works. Each project was different. Some were always going to be difficult, others seemed straightforward, but circumstances changed over time. But in every one of these projects, I had an opportunity to push the boundaries and create a wonderful space for the client and a great advert for my own services. Now, it's important to keep these two motivations in mind because they are like a chicken and egg. I want to do the best for my clients, but I also want to promote the fact to potential future clients. My business depends on its reputation for creating high-quality projects on challenging sites. Over time, I've built a portfolio of projects which attract new clients looking for something similar, and so the cycle continues. Good work leads to more work. Think about that if you are considering hiring an architect. If your project has potential to be something special, it can be an extra motivation for that architect. Now, that does not mean they will give you something for nothing. I charge the same fees irrespective of the job's potential for future promotion. You won't get a discount because the design might end up on a magazine cover or win an award. This is no different to a lawyer taking on a difficult case or a surgeon working against the odds to save someone's life. We might get high praise if we succeed, but professionals expect to be paid regardless of the outcome, and that outcome is never certain. No one goes into this process thinking they will produce an unbuilt design, but an experienced architect will always be mindful that the odds may be against them. As soon as I saw this property in Edinburgh, I knew the stakes were high. It's only 2 stories tall on the street, but on the other side it overlooks a bend in the river, and it's much taller on this side. A public footpath runs on the opposite side of the river in a busy upmarket part of the city, offering a prime view of the site. I've not had a project with this much pressure before or since. You see, my work involves altering and extending private homes. Even when I produce good work, it stays hidden inside someone's house or in their back garden. This project would be very public. If I got this right, it could be a giant 3D billboard for my practice. If I got it wrong, I would never be allowed to forget it. Back in 2013, the owner asked me to design a replacement for the dilapidated wooden conservatory, perched on the corner of the house. The conservatory you see in these images is new. Ultimately, the client decided to replace the old conservatory with a design much the same as the original. This is what the original conservatory looks like. It was made from wood, and because the owners couldn't safely or easily access the outside of the wooden frame, it was slowly disintegrating. The building it was attached to also had some unique issues. First off, it was subdivided between several different neighbours. The lower conservatory and the garage on the street belonged to the property below. The overall structure had been built in several different stages. You can see 2 types of stone and 4 different types of brick in the overall composition. Because of this, the building has moved over time as the different materials settled at different rates. Many of the walls are no longer true vertical or at right angles. Altering or extending an existing structure like this can be a nightmare. The thing about unbuilt projects is that the challenges are often apparent right at the outset, and that was true here. I made my client aware of my concerns right from the start, and they understood the issues. So let's look at the design and see how it evolved. The client needed the new design to be large enough to accommodate 8 people at a dining table. It had to be easily maintained externally and preserve views towards Edinburgh Castle. It also had to provide thermal comfort, not get too hot in the summer or too cold in the winter. So we have size, access to the outside for maintenance, the view, and thermal comfort. That's a lot of things to pack into one small structure. From the outset, it was apparent to me that we would probably never be able to meet all the client's expectations, and I told them so. Keep that in mind if you are planning a project. The more requirements you load into the architect's brief, the greater the possibility things will not go as expected. It's best to write your wish list in order of priority and be prepared to compromise. This is the first iteration of the design. It's got a balcony on the south side and a smaller one on the north. We plan to cut down the existing window to create a door to access that. The roof is a prominent feature to provide both insulation and shade. The large balcony would allow access to the outside for both the view and maintenance. You can see the 3D model doesn't have any materials, and that's okay at this stage of the process. We're just testing ideas, but it was apparent to me that whatever we built this from would need to be zero maintenance in areas under the balcony and the cantilever roof. One thing that came up early in the process was that if the new structure cantilevered over the river, we would need permission to do this. This being Edinburgh, we had learned that the riverbed was privately owned, and Scots law has long-standing provisions for air rights above private property. The client spoke to their lawyers about this and were advised that we could resolve the issue by negotiation. A new block of flats just upstream had balconies over the river, so it must be possible. The next iteration of the design shows how I began thinking about materials. I suggested zinc cladding for the outer face of the balcony and a stainless steel mesh for the balustrade. The design now includes an angled skylight because the client wanted somewhere to place his telescope. The box and skylight are an off-the-shelf item made specially for flat roofs. I also considered using more stainless steel mesh on the underside of the balcony, both to give it a surface worth looking at, but also because that material is maintenance-free. The client liked many of these elements and could see the rationale behind the layout and the materials, but they were still not convinced. This is normal in the design process. You never build the first thing you draw. It takes time to work out the complexity and contradictions inherent in any building. Keep that in mind when working out the design of your next project. Ultimately, my client wanted to increase the amount of daylight into the conservatory. I made the overhanging roof out of glass for this iteration, and I made the windows larger. I don't think anyone was very happy with the glass canopy, so the next iteration got rid of it, and I also introduced a more discreet skylight to the roof. By now, we had pushed this design as far as it could go, and we were still not satisfied. I mean, it looks okay, but there were still unresolved issues. The client finally decided they preferred to maximize view over any consideration of thermal comfort. The roof was just getting in the way. The variety of materials was also unnecessarily complex, so the next iteration of the design was radically changed. The roof and walls were now entirely glass with a steel frame. The balcony was smaller, it didn't extend as far around the side of the house anymore. The balustrade would be simplified to reduce costs and increase light. I also introduced a zinc-clad section between the existing house and the new conservatory because the walls of the house were not 90 degrees to the new structure, so getting them to meet correctly would be impossible. We could achieve this by forming a timber frame off the existing wall, clad it in zinc, and make sure the outer surface was 90 degrees. The zinc section would also house a stove and be where the gutter would collect rainwater from both the new and old roof. This version of the design was a big step forward, but there was one final iteration. We refined the balcony to use stainless steel mesh, and I kept this material on the underside of the balcony so it could be seen from the river footpath below. Now, it's worth pointing out this process played out over several years. I was commissioned by the client in 2013, but we didn't finalize the design until 2017. They often took months between iterations. Keep that in mind when you are planning a project. Do not rush. Take your time. What does it matter if you need a few extra months to consider a design? The end product will probably be standing for decades. It pays to spend time at the outset getting it right. I was very happy with this design. It was well proportioned, modern, and minimal. The client was also finally happy and was keen to proceed. I applied for planning permission and crossed my fingers. Despite the fact the site was very public and the design was daring, there was just one objection from a neighbour and the council approved our application. As far as I was concerned, that was the one unknowable part of the process, and we had succeeded. I honestly thought the planning application stage would be much more challenging, but all I had to do now was get this thing built. If you own a home in the UK and are thinking about altering or extending, you can book an online consultation with me via the Real Life Architect website. I've put a link in the description. Check it out. At this stage, I had been thinking about how the structure would work and was able to explain my ideas to an engineer. Now, normally a conservatory this size would be made from freestanding UPVC or aluminium frame, but the existing house posed a major issue. Because the existing walls had moved over time, they could not be relied on if we sat the new structure directly onto them. Instead, the new conservatory would be a steel cage with long beams going back inside the house so it could span over the wonky walls and not rest on them. This took some time to engineer, and we also had to consider access to the site because this would be very tricky for the contractor. The garage belonged to the downstairs neighbour, and they allowed access for scaffolding over this during construction. We also worked out that using a crane to move the steel cage and the glass would be more cost effective than manually handling these items on site. You can see from these detailed construction drawings how the sequence of work would play out. The existing wooden conservatory would be carefully taken down, including the brick walls supporting it. There was a bedroom directly underneath the conservatory, and this would have its roof stripped and a new one installed. Our conservatory would span over this roof so that it would not interfere with the existing structure. The steel frame would have angle sections to support double glazed units, and these would be finished inside using wooden cladding. Fitting glazing directly to steel is more common in large commercial buildings like skyscrapers. For jobs like this, it's more usual to have the glass inside its own frame. This is how the sponsor of today's video designed their glazing. Sunflex UK manufacture high-quality aluminium frame double-glazed doors and windows. I've worked with Sunflex on several projects, including this one, and I made a full-length video showing how their products offer a great balance between cost and quality. I've put a link to the video in the description and up here. Check it out. So our conservatory got planning approval. The neighbour allowed us access over their roof, the owners of the riverbed would allow us to cantilever over the water, and I was able to work with an engineer to figure out a viable structural solution. So where did it all go wrong? We had been in discussion with several building contractors while developing the design and found one who was willing to work with us to build the conservatory. It took months of back and forth, but by mid-2018 we had established the overall cost would be £130,000 plus VAT. Ultimately, the client decided that was not good value for money. They were happy with my services, and the way they looked at it was that essentially this was a feasibility study. I was paid to thoroughly explore the possibilities, and only if it was feasible would the client actually build it. I think my client believes they got value from my services because they avoided the serious expense of starting construction and only then finding out all the problems. In a way, by doing my job really well, we ended up not building the design. I helped the client avoid what they consider to be an expensive mistake. Now, I should point out that I always ask clients to confirm their budget before we start any new project. On this job, given it was so unusual, there was no reference point. We couldn't look at another similar job and see what that one cost. The client was clear this would be expensive, but no one knew for sure just how expensive it would turn out to be. In the end, the client hired a conservatory manufacturer to replace the existing structure. I don't disagree with their decision, but I still feel a pang of regret whenever I pass this house. I saw its picture on Instagram recently, and this prompted me to look back at my unbuilt projects. I've got several others coming up, so if you found this one interesting, please subscribe to the channel to catch the next video. My name is Neil, and I'm a real-life architect in the UK. I make videos about the reality of altering and extending private homes.